I was born on April 16th, 1889 at 8 o'clock at night in East Lane, Walworth. Soon after we moved to West Square, St. George's Road, Lambeth. According to Mother, my world was a happy one. Our circumstances were moderately comfortable. We lived in 3 tastefully furnished rooms. One of my early recollections was that each night before Mother went to the theatre, Sidney and I were lovingly tucked up in a comfortable bed and left in the care of the housemaid. In my world of 3.5 years, all things were possible. If Sidney, who was 4 years older than I, could perform legerdemain and swallow a coin and make it come out through the back of his head, I could do the same. So I swallowed a halfpenny, and Mother was obliged to send for a doctor. Every night, after she came home from the theatre, it was her custom to leave delicacies on the table for Sidney and me to find in the morning, a slice of Neapolitan cake or candies, with the understanding that we were not to make a noise in the morning, as she usually slept late. Mother was a soubrette on the variety stage, a mignon in her late 20s, with fair complexion, violet blue eyes, and long, light brown hair that she could sit upon. Sidney and I adored our mother. Though she was not an exceptional beauty, we thought her divine-looking. Those who knew her told me in later years that she was dainty and attractive and had compelling charm. She took pride in dressing us up for Sunday exertions, Sidney in an Eton suit with long trousers, and me in a blue velvet one with blue gloves to match. Such occasions were orgies of smugness as we ambled along the Kennington Road. London was sedate in those days. The tempo was sedate. Even the horse-drawn tramcars along Westminster Bridge Road went at a sedate pace and turned sedately on a revolving table at the terminal near the bridge. In Mother's prosperous days, we also lived in Westminster Bridge Road. Its atmosphere was gay and friendly, with attractive shops, restaurants, and music halls. The fruit shop on the corner facing the bridge was a galaxy of color, with its neatly arranged pyramids of oranges, apples, pears, and bananas outside, in contrast to the solemn grey Houses of Parliament directly across the river. This was the London of my childhood, of my moods and awakenings, memories of Lambeth in spring, of trivial incidents and things, of riding with Mother on top of a horse bus trying to touch passing lilac trees, of the many-coloured bus tickets, orange, blue, pink, and green, that bestrewed the pavement where the trams and buses stopped, of rubicund flower girls at the corner of Westminster Bridge, making gay boutonnieres, their adroit fingers manipulating tinsel and quivering fern, of the humid odour of freshly watered roses that affected me with a vague sadness, of melancholy Sundays and pale-faced parents and their children escorting toy windmills and coloured balloons over Westminster Bridge, and the maternal penny streamers that softly lowered their funnels as they glided under it. From such trivia I believed my soul was born. Then objects in our sitting-room that affected my senses. Mother's life-size painting of Nell Gwynn, which I disliked, the long-necked decanters on our sideboard, which depressed me, and the small, round music box with its enamelled surfaces, depicting angels on clouds, which both pleased and baffled me. But my 6-penny toy chair brought from the gypsies I loved because it gave me an inordinate sense of possession. Memories of epic moments, a visit to the Royal Aquarium, viewing its sideshows with Mother, watching She, the live head of a lady smiling in flames, the 6-penny lucky dip, Mother lifting me up to a large sawdust barrel to pick a surprise packet that contained a candy whistle, which would not blow, and a toy ruby brooch. Then a visit to the Canterbury Music Hall, sitting in a red plush seat, watching my father perform. Now it is night, and I am wrapped in a travelling rug, on top of a four-in-hand coach, driving with Mother and her theatrical friends, corseted in their gaiety and laughter, as our trumpeter, with clarion braggadocio, heralds us along the Kennington Road to the rhythmic jingle of harness and the beat of horses' hoofs. Then something happened. It could have been a month or a few days later. A sudden realization that all was not well with Mother and the outside world. She had been away all the morning with a lady friend and had returned home in a state of excitement. I was playing on the floor and became conscious of intense agitation going on above me, as though I were listening from the bottom of a well. There were passionate exclamations and tears from Mother, who kept mentioning the name Armstrong. Armstrong said this, Armstrong said that. Armstrong was a brute. Her excitement was strange and intense, so that I began to cry, so much so that Mother was obliged to pick me up and console me. A few years later I learned the significance of that afternoon. Mother had returned from the law courts where she had been suing my father for non-support of her children, and the case had not gone too well for her. Armstrong was my father's lawyer. I was hardly aware of a father, and do not remember him having lived with us. He too was a vaudevillian, a quiet, brooding man with dark eyes. Mother said he looked like Napoleon. He had a light baritone voice and was considered a very fine artist. Even in those days he earned the considerable sum of £40 a week. The trouble was that he drank too much, which Mother said was the cause of their separation. It was difficult for vaudevillians not to drink in those days, for alcohol was sold in all theatres, and after a performer's act he was expected to go to the theatre bar and drink with the customers. Some theatres made more profit from the bar than from the box office, and a number of stars were paid large salaries not alone for their talent, but because they spent most of their money at the theatre bar. Thus many an artist was ruined by drink. My father was one of them. He died of alcoholic excess at the age of 37. Mother would tell stories about him with humor and sadness. He had a violent temper when drinking, and during one of his tantrums she ran off to Brighton with some friends, and in answer to his frantic telegram, "What are you up to? Answer at once!" she wired back, "Balls, parties, and picnics, darling." Mother was the elder of 2 daughters. Her father, Charles Hill, an Irish cobbler, came from County Cork, Ireland. He had rosy apple cheeks, a shock of white hair, and a beard like Carlyle in Whistler's portrait. He had doubled over with rheumatic gout, due, he said, to sleeping in damp fields, hiding from the police during the nationalist uprisings. He eventually settled in London, establishing himself in a boot-repairing business in East Lane, Walworth. Grandpa was half gypsy. This fact was the skeleton on our family cupboard. Nevertheless, Grandma bragged that her family always paid ground rent. Her maiden name was Smith. I remember her as a bright little old lady who always greeted me effusively with baby talk. She died before I was 6. She was separated from Grandpa, for what reason neither grandparent would tell, but according to Aunt Kate there was a domestic triangle in which Grandpa surprised Grandma with her lover. To gauge the morals of our family by commonplace standards would be as erroneous as putting a thermometer in boiling water. With such genetic attributes, 2 pretty cobbler's daughters quickly left home and gravitated towards the stage. Aunt Kate, Mother's youngest sister, was also a soubrette, but we knew little about her, for she wove in and out of our lives sporadically. She was pretty and temperamental, and never got along very well with Mother. Her occasional visits usually ended abruptly with acrimony at something Mother had said or done. At 18, Mother eloped with a middle-aged man to Africa. She often spoke of her life there, living in luxury amidst plantations, servants, and saddle horses. In her 18th year, my brother Sidney was born. I was told he was the son of a lord, and that when he reached the age of 21 he would inherit a fortune of £2,000, which information both pleased and annoyed me. Mother did not stay long in Africa, but returned to England and married my father. I had no knowledge of what ended the African episode, but in our extreme poverty I would reproach her for giving up such a wonderful life. She would laugh and say that she was too young to be cautious or wise. What degree of feeling she had for my father I never knew, but whenever she spoke of him it was without bitterness, which makes me suspect she was too objective to have been deeply in love. Sometimes she would give a sympathetic account of him, and at other times talk of his drunkenness and violence. In later years, whenever angry with me, she would ruefully say, "You'll wind up in the gutter like your father." She had known Father before she went to Africa. They had been sweethearts, and had played together in the same Irish melodrama called Seamus O'Brien. At 16 she played the leading role. While touring with this company, she met and ran off with the middle-aged lord to Africa. When she returned to England, father took up the broken threads of their romance and they married. 3 years later, I was born. What other facts besides drink were involved I do not know, but a year after my birth my parents separated. Mother did not seek alimony. Being a star in her own right, earning £25 a week, she was well able to support herself and her children. Only when ill fortune befell her did she seek relief. Otherwise, she would never have taken legal steps. She had been having trouble with her voice. It was never strong, and the slightest cold brought a laryngitis which lasted for weeks, but she was obliged to keep working, so that her voice grew progressively worse. She could not rely on it. In the middle of singing it would crack, or suddenly disappear into a whisper, and the audience would laugh and start booing. The worry of it impaired her health and made her a nervous wreck. As a consequence, her theatrical engagements fell off until they were practically nil. It was owing to her vocal condition that at the age of 5 I made my first appearance on the stage. Mother usually brought me to the theatre at night in preference to leaving me alone in rented rooms. She was playing the canteen at Aldershot at the time, a grubby, mean theatre catering mostly to soldiers. They were a rowdy lot, and wanted little excuse to deride and ridicule. To performers, Aldershot was a week of terror. I remember standing in the wings when Mother's voice cracked and went into a whisper. The audience began to laugh and sing falsetto and to make catcalls. It was all vague, and I did not quite understand what was going on. But the noise increased until Mother was obliged to walk off the stage. When she came into the wings, she was very upset and argued with the stage manager, who, having seen me perform before Mother's friends, said something about letting me go in her place. And in the turmoil I remember him leading me by hand, and after a few explanatory words to the audience, leaving me on the stage alone. And before a glare of footlights and faces in smoke, I started to sing, accompanied by the orchestra, which fiddled about until it found my key. It was a well-known song called Jack Jones, and went as follows. Jack Jones, well and known to everybody round about the market, don't you see? I've no fault to find with Jack and all, not when he's as he used to be. Halfway through, a shower of money poured onto the stage. Immediately I stopped and announced that I would pick up the money first and sing afterwards. This caused much laughter. The stage manager came on with a handkerchief and helped me to gather it up. I thought he was going to keep it. The thought was conveyed to the audience and increased their laughter, especially when he walked off with it, with me anxiously following him. Not until he handed it to Mother did I return and continue to sing. I was quite at home. I talked to the audience, danced, and did several imitations, including one of Mother singing her Irish march song. And in repeating the chorus, in all innocence, I imitated Mother's voice cracking, and was surprised at the impact it had on the audience. There was laughter and cheers, then more money throwing, and when Mother came on the stage to carry me off, her presence evoked tremendous applause. That night was my first appearance on the stage, and Mother's last. When the fates deal in human destiny, they heed neither pity nor justice. Thus they dealt with Mother. She never regained her voice. As autumn turns to winter, so our circumstances turned from bad to worse. Although Mother was careful and had saved a little money, that very soon vanished, as did her jewelry and other small possessions which she pawned in order to live, hoping all the while that her voice would return. Meanwhile, from 3 comfortable rooms we moved into 2, then into 1, our belongings dwindling and the neighborhoods into which we moved growing progressively drabber. She turned to religion, in the hope, I suppose, that it would restore her voice. She regularly attended Christ Church in the Westminster Bridge Road, and every Sunday I was made to sit through box organ music and to listen with aching impatience to the Reverend F.B. Meyer's fervent and dramatic voice echoing down the nave like shuffling feet. His orations must have been appealing, for occasionally I would catch Mother quietly wiping away a tear, which slightly embarrassed me. Well do I remember Holy Communion on one hot summer's day, and the cool silver cup containing delicious grape juice that was passed along the congregation. and Mother's gentle restraining hand when I drank too much of it. And how relieved I was when the Reverend closed the Bible, for it meant that the sermon would soon end and they would start prayers and the final hymn. Since Mother had joined the church, she seldom saw her theatrical friends. That world had evaporated, had become only a memory. It seemed that we had always lived in wretched circumstances. The interim of 1 year seemed a lifetime of travail. Now we existed in cheerless twilight. Jobs were hard to find, and Mother, untutored in everything but the stage, was further handicapped. She was small, dainty, and sensitive, fighting against terrific odds in a Victorian era in which wealth and poverty were extreme, and poor-class women had little choice but to do menial work or be the drudges of sweatshops. Occasionally she obtained work nursing, but such employment was rare and of short duration. Nevertheless, she was resourceful. Having made her own theatrical costumes, she was expert with her needle and able to earn a few shillings dressmaking for members of the church. But it was barely enough to support the three of us. Because of Father's drinking, his theatrical engagements became irregular, as did his payments of 10 shillings a week. Mother had now sold most of her belongings. The last thing to go was a trunk of theatrical costumes. These things she clung to in hope that she might recover her voice and return to the stage. Occasionally, she would delve into the trunk to find something, and we would see a spangled costume or wig and would ask her to put them on. I remember her donning a judge's cap and gown and singing in her weak voice one of her old song successes that she had written herself. With amazing ease, she would then break into a graceful dance and forget her dressmaking and regale us with her other song successes and perform the dances that went with them until she was breathless and exhausted. Then she would reminisce and show us some of her old playbills. One read, "Engagement Extraordinary," of the dainty and talented Lily Harley, serio-comedian, impersonator, and dancer. She would perform before us, not only with her own vaudeville material, but with imitations of other actresses she had seen in the so-called legitimate theatre. When narrating a play, she would act the various parts. For instance, in The Signs of the Cross, Mercia, with divine light in her eyes, going into the arena to be fed to the lions, she would imitate the high pontifical voice of Wilson Barrett, proclaiming in 5-inch elevated shoes, for he was a little man, "What this Christianity is, I know not, but this I do know, that if it made such women as Mercia, Rome, nay, the whole world would all be purer for it," which she acted with a suspicion of humour, but not without an appreciation of Barrett's talent. Her instinct was unfailing in recognizing those that had genuine talent. Whether it was the actress Ellen Terry or Joe Elvin of the music hall, she would explain their art. She knew technique instinctively and talked of theatre as only one who loved it could. She would tell anecdotes and act them out, recounting, for instance, an episode in the life of Emperor Napoleon, tiptoeing in his library to reach for a book and being intercepted by Marshal Ney, Mother playing both characters but always with humour. "Sire, allow me to get it for you. I am higher." And Napoleon, with an indignant scowl, saying, "Higher? Taller." She would enact Nell Gwyn, vividly describing her leaning over the palace stairs, holding a baby, threatening Charles II. "Give this child a name, or I'll dash it to the ground." And King Charles hastily concurring, "All right, the Duke of St. Albans." I remember an evening in our one room in the basement at Oakley Street. I lay in bed recovering from a fever. Sidney had gone out to night school, and Mother and I were alone. It was late afternoon, and she sat with her back to the window, reading, acting, and explaining in her inimitable way the New Testament and Christ's love and pity for the poor and for the little children. Perhaps her emotion was due to my illness, but she gave the most luminous and appealing interpretation of Christ that I had ever heard or seen. She spoke of his tolerant understanding, of the women who had sinned and was to be stoned by the mob, and his words to them, "He that is without sin among you, let him first cast a stone at her." She read into the dusk, stopping only to light the lamp, then told of the faith that Jesus inspired in the sick, that they had only to touch the hem of his garment to be healed. She told of the hate and jealousy of the high priests and Pharisees, and described Jesus and his arrest in calm dignity before Pontius Pilate, who, washing his hands, said, then she acted out histrionically, "I find no fault with this man." She told how they stripped and scourged him, placing a crown of thorns on his head, mocked and spat at him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" As she continued, tears welled up in her eyes. She told of Simon helping to carry Christ's cross and the appealing look of gratitude Jesus gave him. She told of Barabbas, the repentant, dying with him on a cross and asking forgiveness, and of Jesus saying, "Today shalt thou be with me in paradise," and from the cross looking down at his mother, saying, "Woman, behold thy son," in his last dying agony, crying out, "My God, why hast thou forsaken me?" And we both wept. "Don't you see," said Mother, "how human he was? Like all of us, he too suffered doubt." Mother had so carried me away that I wanted to die that very night and meet Jesus. But Mother was not so enthusiastic. "Jesus wants you to live first and fulfill your destiny here," she said. In that dark room in the basement at Oakley Street, Mother illuminated to me the kindliest light this world has ever known, which has endowed literature and the theater with the greatest and richest themes: love, pity, and humanity. Living as we did in the lower strata, it was very easy to fall into the habit of not caring about our diction. But Mother always stood outside her environment and kept an alert ear for the way we talked, correcting our grammar and making us feel that we were distinguished. As we sank further into poverty, I would, in my childish ignorance, reproach her for not going back to the stage. She would smile and say that life was false and artificial, and that in such a world one could so easily forget God. Yet whenever she talked of the theater, she would forget herself and again get carried away with enthusiasm. Some days after reminiscing, she would fall into a long silence as she bent over her needlework, and I would grow moody because we were no longer a part of that glamorous life, and Mother would look up and see me forlorn and would cheerfully console me. Winter was approaching, and Sidney ran out of clothes, so Mother made him a coat from her old velvet jacket. It had red and black striped sleeves, pleated at the shoulders, which Mother did her best to get rid of, but with little success. Sidney wept when he was made to wear it. "What will all the boys at school think?" "Who cares what people think?" she said. "Besides, it looks very distinguished." Mother had such a persuasive way that Sidney to this day has never understood why he ever submitted to wearing it. But he did, and the coat and a pair of Mother's cut-down high-heeled shoes got him into many a fight at school. The boys called him Joseph and his coat of many colours, and I, with a pair of Mother's red tights cut down for stockings, which looked as though they were pleated, was called Sir Francis Drake. At the depth of this dolorous period, Mother began to develop migraine headaches and was forced to give up her needlework, and for days was obliged to lie in a dark room with tea-leaf bandages over her eyes. Picasso had a blue period. We had a grey one, in which we lived on a parochial charity, soup tickets and relief parcels. Nevertheless, Sidney sold newspapers between school hours, and though his contribution was less than a drop in the bucket, it did give a modicum of aid. But in every crisis there is always a climax. In our case, the crisis was a happy one. One day, while Mother was recovering, with a bandage still over her eyes, Sidney came bursting into the darkened room, throwing his newspapers on the bed and exclaiming, "I found a purse!" He handed it to Mother. When she opened it, she saw a pile of silver and copper coins. Quickly she closed it, then fell back onto the bed from excitement. Sidney had been mounting buses to sell his newspapers. On top of one bus, he saw a purse on an empty seat. Quickly, he dropped a newspaper over it as if by accident, then picked it up and the purse with it, and hurried off the bus. Behind a billboard on an empty lot, he opened the purse and saw a pile of silver and copper coins. He told us that his heart leapt, and without counting the money, he closed the purse and ran home. When Mother recovered, she emptied its contents on the bed, but the purse was still heavy. There was a middle pocket. Mother opened it and saw 7 golden sovereigns. Our joy was hysterical. The purse contained no address, thank God, so Mother's religious scruples were little exercised. Although a pale cast of thought was given to the owner's misfortune, it was, however, quickly dispelled by Mother's belief that God had sent it as a blessing from heaven. Whether Mother's illness was physical or psychological I do not know, but she recovered within a week. As soon as she was well, we went to Southend-on-Sea for a holiday, Mother outfitting us completely with new clothes. My first sight of the sea was hypnotic. As I approached it in bright sunlight from a hilly street, it looked suspended, a live, quivering monster about to fall on me. The 3 of us took off our shoes and paddled, the tepid sea unfurling over my insteps and around my ankles, and the soft, yielding sand under my feet were a revelation of delight. What a day that was! The saffron beach, with its pink and blue pails and wooden spades, its colored tents and umbrellas, and sailing boats, hurtling gaily over laughing little waves, and up on the beach other boats resting idly on their sides, smelling of seaweed and tar. The memory of it still lingers with enchantment. In 1957 I went to Southend and looked in vain for the narrow, hilly street from which I had seen the sea for the first time, but there were no traces of it. At the end of the town were the remnants of what seemed a familiar fishing village, with old-fashioned shop-fronts. This had vague whisperings of the past. Perhaps it was the odor of seaweed and tar. Like sand in an hourglass, our finances ran out, and hard times again pursued us. Mother sought other employment, but there was little to be found. Problems began mounting. Installment payments were behind. Consequently, Mother's sewing machine was taken away, and Father's payments of 10 shillings a week had completely stopped. In desperation, she sought a new solicitor, who, seeing little remuneration in the case, advised her to throw herself and her children on the support of the Lambeth Borough authorities, in order to make Father pay for our support. There was no alternative. She was burdened with 2 children and in poor health, and so she decided that the 3 of us should enter the Lambeth workhouse.